It's March 9th, 2024, and welcome to Political Dharma with Alan Zundell. That's me. And I hope this podcast finds you doing well. In this week's stories, the United States Supreme Court stops states from keeping Donald Trump off their ballots. Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gets on the ballot in a couple more states. And independent presidential candidate Cornel West fails in an attempt to get on the ballot in the state of California. At the end of the show, I'll also have some thoughts to share about the major party primaries that happened over the last week. So to start, on Monday, the United States Supreme Court released its decision on Trump versus Anderson, and you've very likely already heard something about this already, but I wanted to briefly review the decision and then offer some thoughts of my own, particularly in light of what my theme has been on these podcasts, which is how difficult it is for non-major party candidates to get on the ballot in all the states. The court unanimously reversed the decision of the Colorado Supreme Court, which had banned Trump from its ballot based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Section 3 bars candidates from office who had been involved in an insurrection against the U.S. government. The Supreme Court reversed the ban on the grounds that the Constitution made Congress and not the states responsible for enforcing the provisions of the 14th Amendment. They found these grounds in Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which states that, quote, the Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article, end quote. The majority on the court offered several arguments in support of their contention that only Congress can enforce the ban, but a minority of the court, all the female justices, as a matter of fact, argued that it was unnecessary to rule out possible federal judicial enforcement. This was the outcome I predicted in my February 10th episode after listening to oral arguments before the court. It allowed the court to avoid the politically fraught decision of keeping Donald Trump off the ballot by simply denying that the states had the authority to do so, therefore keeping any of the states from doing that. What I want to focus on, though, is an argument that all of the justices agreed on, but which I find to be hypocritical. All of the justices agreed with the majority's concern that allowing the states to make this determination wouldn't produce a uniform result across the nation, as different states could use different methods to determine whether a candidate should be barred from their ballot. They go on to say that such a, quote, patchwork, end quote, of differing decisions, with votes in some states affected by the votes not allowed to be cast in other states, would, quote, dramatically change the behavior of voters, parties, and states across the country, end quote. There's an obvious blind spot in this argument. Currently, presidential candidates who are independent or minor party nominees are subject to differing ballot access requirements in different states. This can and does result in a quote-unquote patchwork of results in which those candidates appear on the ballots in some states, but not in others. And as the court says, the fact that they do not appear on the ballot in all the states means that it can affect the voters' decisions in states where they are on the ballot, such as assessing the viability of the candidate and therefore making a decision about whether it's worth their vote to cast it for the candidate. It affects voter behavior, party behavior, and the entire electoral system, just as the court suggested it does. This blind spot is the pervasive acceptance of a double standard for major party and other candidates for office. As I've been covering in episode after episode of this podcast, independent and minor party presidential candidates have plenty of obstacles to attaining ballot access across the nation. I defy the constitutional originalists in the court's conservative majority to show that a two-party system was either intended by the framers or approved in the text of the Constitution. Quite to the contrary, the founders feared the divisiveness of political factions. Yet here we are with the majority voters who are either independent or reluctant major party voters feeling like their only viable choices are two unappealing candidates from two increasingly unpopular political parties. According to the logic of the court, the rules for getting on the ballot should be uniform across the nation for all presidential candidates. But that's not the way it is. So let's turn once again to the efforts of alternative presidential candidates to get on the ballot in the different states. On Tuesday, the presidential campaign of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced that it had obtained more than 15,000 signatures on petitions to put his name on the ballot in the state of Nevada. Nevada requires at least 10,000 signatures, so Kennedy should be on the ballot in that state in November. The campaign also announced success with its lawsuit against Idaho for the state's relatively early March 15th deadline for turning in signatures. The state legislature is now working to extend the deadline, and the judge in the case said he would extend the deadline himself if they did not act swiftly enough. Nevada is a swing state like Georgia and Arizona, and it joins those states in having Kennedy on the ballot. As I've said in the last episode of Political Dharma, as well as other episodes, getting on the ballot in swing states is Kennedy's best shot at winning electoral college votes. Meanwhile, American Values 2024, the super PAC independently supporting Kennedy's campaign, has collected over 17,000 signatures in South Carolina, again exceeding the 10,000 required. So Kennedy will be on the ballot in that state as well. And they're getting very close in Michigan, having collected over 29,000 signatures toward the required 30,000. Michigan is another swing state. According to my running tally, at present, Kennedy has met the requirements to be on the ballot in 7 states: Utah, New Hampshire, Georgia, Arizona, Hawaii, Nevada, and South Carolina. Going back to the news about Kennedy's lawsuit against Idaho for its early deadline, last week I said that Kennedy had lawsuits against 3 states regarding ballot access and named them as Maine, Idaho, and Maine. I meant to say Utah as the first state and accidentally said Maine. Regarding the Maine case, on Monday, Ballot Access News reported that the federal judge upheld the state's refusal to allow Kennedy petitioners to gather signatures at voting locations during the March 5th presidential primary. The judge agreed with the state that it was sufficient to allow the Kennedy campaign to petition at the June 11th primary for non-presidential offices. All 3 cases have now been decided, with agreements to move the signature deadlines in Utah and Idaho, and in Maine, the refusal to allow Kennedy petitioners to gather signatures on Super Tuesday. Of course, that doesn't mean that the campaign is not going to be filing more lawsuits as it continues to try to gain ballot access in the various states. And independent presidential candidate Cornel West hit a snag this week in his efforts to get on the ballot in California. He was seeking the nomination of the small Peace and Freedom Party, which only exists in California. And I thought he had a good chance based on the fact that he's a socialist and it's a socialist party, and he was much better known than the other candidates. Despite that, West lost the nomination to Claudia de la Cruz, with West receiving about 40% of the vote to de la Cruz's 46.4%. Less than 10,000 people voted in the Peace and Freedom primary. The Peace and Freedom Party has a ballot line in California, so if West had received their nomination, he would have been guaranteed a place on the ballot in that state. So who is Claudia de la Cruz? Here's a short clip from the Now This Impact YouTube channel.
Meet the 2 socialist women trying to eat the rich en route to the presidency, Claudia de la Cruz and Karina Garcia. Who are they? Claudia de la Cruz was born and raised in the South Bronx to Dominican immigrants. When she was 13, she joined campaigns to free political prisoners, she advocated for Palestinian freedom, and she protested against police terror. In her adulthood, she co-founded a youth leadership development project to build sisterhood, learn histories of struggle and resistance, and engage in collective action for justice. Having dedicated almost 3 decades to grassroots initiatives in Black and Latine neighborhoods, Claudia says she wants to extend her impact to communities nationwide, which is why she's mounting a third-party run for president with the Party for Socialism and Liberation alongside her VP pick, Karina Garcia.
The Party of Socialism and Liberation is a small party which in 2020 was able to get its presidential candidate on the ballot in about 15 states. In both 2020 and 2016, its presidential candidate also received the nomination of the Peace and Freedom Party, just as de la Cruz has this year. Given this past history, and as the Peace and Freedom Party describes itself as a feminist socialist party, I shouldn't have been surprised that Dela Cruz managed to beat out Cornel West for the party's nomination. It may turn out that Dela Cruz actually does better in the general election than West, depending on which one of them is able to get on the ballot in more states. Who knows what's going to happen? But I don't expect West to give up on California, as it's the most highly populated state in the nation. He'll likely turn to registering his new Justice for All party with the California Secretary of State and try to get enough voters to register with the party so that it can qualify for a place on the ballot. As a side note, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ramped up his use of that same tactic to get his new We the People party on the ballot in California. Here's a clip from the YouTube channel of Fox 11 Los Angeles.
The Kennedy campaign now seeking November ballot access across the country. Here in California, that effort involves gathering signatures for a new political party called We the People.
Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. joins us live right now from his L.A. home with more. Great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
See you again, Alex. Good to see you, Marla.
So talk to us about how this would work. What are the logistics involved in making this happen, and what will this new party be all about?
We will be on the ballot in all 50 states, but our strategy for getting on the ballot differs state by state. And in 6 states, we are starting our own political party because that's the easiest way to get on the ballot. California is one of those. The party is called We the People. We need 75,000 Californians to change their registration between now and June to our new party. They can do that by going to our website, kennedy24.com/California. And it will tell you you should have your driver's license there because you need the same address that is on your driver's license. But it's a couple of steps, but anybody can do it. And we're really starting that ballot drive today.
Well, congratulations on launching that effort.
Cornel West doesn't have the resources that Kennedy has to get voters' attention, but getting them to register with his party is his best bet for getting on the ballot in California. Currently, he's on the ballot in 3 states, in Alaska, Oregon, and North Carolina, in each case becoming the nominee of a small political party. Let's turn now to the major parties. On Super Tuesday this week, Republicans held primaries in 14 states and caucuses in Utah and the Territory of American Samoa. Democrats held primaries in 15 states, plus caucuses in American Samoa, and on Wednesday in Hawaii. The graphic you see if you're watching the video version of the podcast is from Ballotpedia. Donald Trump and Joe Biden dominated almost every race they were in, although losing first place in a couple of instances. Nikki Haley came in first in Vermont with about half the vote to Trump's 46%. She had also come in first in the District of Columbia the previous week. Trump won by large margins everywhere else. Haley suspended her campaign the day after Super Tuesday and pointedly did not endorse Trump. On the Democratic side, in American Samoa, Joe Biden lost to Jason Palmer, a virtually unknown candidate who spent a lot of time online courting American Samoan voters from his home on the U.S. mainland. Palmer got 56% to Biden's 44%. Like Trump, Biden won by large margins everywhere else. And on Wednesday, Democratic candidate Dean Phillips also suspended his campaign, having come in first nowhere and behind Marianne Williamson in several states. Phillips did endorse Biden. At this point, there can be little doubt that Trump and Biden are going to be their respective parties' nominees for the general election. But the primaries weren't all good news for them. The results showed significant weaknesses that could hurt each of them in the general election. In Trump's case, his rival Nikki Haley won in 2 places and was in the double digits in her vote share just about everywhere else, including over a third of the voters in Massachusetts. This shows a large share of the voters who cared enough to participate in the Republican primaries were unfavorable towards Trump. For Biden, his chief rival was different. After a proof of concept the previous week in Michigan, hundreds of thousands of Super Tuesday voters chose uncommitted as a protest against Biden's policy towards Israel's war in Gaza. Uncommitted or variations such as no preference won shares of the vote in multiple states with highs of 29% in Hawaii and 19% in Minnesota. When you add this to the shares of the vote received by Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips, it shows a significant number of the voters who cared enough to participate in the Democratic primaries were at least dissatisfied and in some cases outraged at Biden. This dissatisfaction with the two major parties, as I've said before, creates an opening for alternative presidential candidates, and that's what this show is about. Our main topic is covering those candidates. This coming Tuesday, there's going to be a few more major party primaries, but there's no suspense in the outcomes there. If you got something out of this podcast, show it by hitting the like button, the thumbs up button. Leave comments if you have any. Share it with friends. And if you don't want to miss an episode, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. If you want to contribute to the support of the show financially, you can find a secure PayPal link at the end of the program description for this episode. I think that's it. I appreciate all the comments and the donations that I've gotten. Hope to see you again next week and see where this all leads us. Thanks for watching.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus, the moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.